Hello and welcome to episode 37 of The List Makers, a Doctor Who show spin-off podcast. I'm Dave.
I'm Rob.
And tonight's topic is top 5 non-fiction books. Now, I didn't actually specify this at the time, but I think we can assume we mean top 5 non-fiction Doctor Who books, right?
Yes, I haven't been that weird with my choices.
Excellent. Well, we'll dive in then. It's your turn to make your list first, Rob. Okay. I have no idea how many snaps we have here. We could have none, we could have 5. It's such a wide topic.
Oh, Dave, my list, I've tried to cram so much in and I have more than double that as runners-up.
Yep.
So if we're not mentioning the same stuff tonight, there is a problem, basically.
I suspect between our honourable mentions and our lists, there will be snaps, but do they make the top 5? Let's find out. Rob, what's your list?
Okay, in at number 5, Dave, I've gone with Dylan Rees's book, Downtime, which is a look at the direct-to-video Doctor Who knockoffs, for want of a better word, that were coming out in the 90s, in the wilderness years, and also some audio series that were spawned too. Dylan, of course, does the Too Hot for TV podcast that I've been on a couple of times. Dave, I believe you're recording for soon?
I don't know if that's public knowledge yet, but I believe so.
Okay, it is now. And he's also been on various Doctor Who show episodes as co-host with me. So he's a real friend of the show. And one of his areas of interest is this era that produced some truly bonkers stuff. Think stuff like The Stranger, Probe, Auton, stuff like that. And now combine that with the fact that Dylan works in TV and even has an Emmy Award, and he's eminently qualified to be writing and interviewing about this kind of production stuff. So that's my pick at number 5.
Nice.
2 books here at number 4 from another friend of the show, someone who's been on with us 3 times, in fact, Paul Hayes. And the books are The Long Game, which covers the era of 1996 to 2003 in relation to how Doctor Who came back to our TVs in 2005. And the other is Pull to Open, which is the story of how Doctor Who came to be in the first place back in the 60s. Now, the former is a story that hasn't been really properly covered in a book like that before, so it was absolutely fascinating, full stop. The latter is a story we all know as fans to some degree, but with additional work and research, Paul really knocks that into an almost brand new shape as well. So whether it's classic or modern, 2 really good books here from Paul Hayes, packed with information for you to pick up if that's what you want to delve into.
Nice.
In at number 3, it's getting tougher with each pick now. So at 3, I'm going with a tie between Script Doctor by Andrew Cartmel and Who and Me by Barry Letts. Obviously, one's a script editor, the other's a producer, sometimes writer, sometimes director. So they're not exactly the same. They're obviously from quite different eras of the show, but I find both of these books really readable, really interesting. And they're just so Moorish. If you're in the mood for first-hand accounts of what it felt like to be there rather than a step removed, these are great. In at number 2, it's ridiculously tough to pick this spot, but I'm going with the Howe, Stammers and Walker trilogy of books, Doctor Who the 60s, Doctor Who the 70s and Doctor Who the 80s. These are just such a joy to open up as they have lots of images, lots of things to look at, as well as text covering each decade of Doctor Who. Obviously, you can tell that from the titles. Can you find more in-depth reads? Absolutely you can, but as a product of their era in the early 90s, these books became the standard, I think, for fans who wanted something that covered their favourite show in a holistic sort of way by decade. And don't get too bogged down. I'm avoiding saying they're light reading because that would give people the wrong idea entirely. But they're certainly not Doctor Who the unfolding text for anyone unfortunate enough to ever read that or tried reading that. Yeah.
No.
And finally, number 1, Dave, some people may have guessed this, as I've spoken about it in different ways over the years on the podcast. It's an older book. It's not the best researched book. It's not the most informative book. In fact, it's not the best book, full stop, but it's here at number 1 because it's a book that meant a lot to me circa 1987 when I was accelerating my fandom just as fast as I could, just soaking up everything I could find. And that book is 1983's Doctor Who, A Celebration by Peter Haining. And it came out to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the show. It had pieces on all the Doctors to date at the time, in theory written by each of them. Even though Hartnell had been dead for 8 years at that stage, I think they just took comments of his from interviews and cobbled together this little piece like he had actually written it. It also did have pieces, though, written by Verity Lambert, who was still alive at the time, Terry Nation, who was still alive at the time, Terence Dix, who was, you get the picture, Barry Letts, J&T, as well as information about really important aspects of the show, like the Master and Gallifrey and such. I just loved it. I would borrow it from the library again and again and again. And in later years of my fandom, actually bought a really nicely preserved hardcover of it, which I have on my shelf just over there. And the real beauty of the book, Dave, even now, is because they sold over 100,000 copies of this book, it's by no means rare. You can find it quite easily and at a pretty good price too, which always makes for a really good collectible. It's just a lovely little curio that I think classic era fans should own. And that's my number one.
Excellent.
I do have a lot of runners-up, but I'll let you make your list first.
As do I. And normally it's me who's a little bit liberal with the use of a top 5, as opposed to you who managed to squeeze a top 9 or so into the 8 or 9.
7, Dave.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Oh, you're counting the trilogy of House Stammer. Okay. I get it.
That's what trilogy means, Rob. 3 books.
Okay. I squeezed in 9.
You squeezed in 9. I've got a strict 5, but that's okay. It's all fun and games here at the List Makers. I'll dive into my list.
Okay.
Number 5, Blue Box Boy by Matthew Waterhouse.
Oh, yeah. Great.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of great bios there, Rob, and I do think they are very, very good bios. I'm a particularly fond of Blue Box Boy because it is such a frank biography of Matthew Waterhouse's time on the show. It's incredibly raw, it's incredibly honest, and it genuinely makes you feel as though you can understand what those sets were like in season 18 and season 19. And it's just such a wonderful insight from an actor I really liked and a character that meant a lot to me as a kid. So that's there at number 5.
And written in the third person, isn't it?
It is written in the third person, and look, that's an interesting take, but once you get past that, who cares?
Good.
Number 4, I've gone for The Discontinuity Guide by Paul Cornell, Martin Day, and Keith Topping. Mm-hmm. Now, this came out in 1994. It was a compendium of the stories, but also things like bloopers, references, opinions, all these different sort of information put together in a really fun way. And it was the start of a sort of wave of books by fans that were just having fun with the show and enjoying it. And it means a lot to me. It was a book I read again and again and again. And a number of friends of the podcast are mentioned in the acknowledgements there. Richard from Spacefall, who's on here. Rob from 42 to Doomsday. Todd and Nathan from Flight Through Entirety, all mentioned in there. So this is at the time when fandom was really starting to become global. The internet was becoming a thing and fans could contribute to books that they wanted to contribute to. So a really cool thing. Mm-hmm. Number 3, David Banks's Cyberman book.
Oh, yeah.
This ticks a lot of boxes. 1, it's a part of my childhood, so it's really special and really important to me. 2, it's a properly gorgeous book. Whether it's the cover art, which is just absolutely stunning, all of the artwork that goes in there, stuff like art recreations of scenes from Tomb of the Cybermen and The Wheel in Space, all just sort of wonderful. It's laid out really well, but it's just got so much information. It's got actual background information of all the Cybermen stories. It's got a whole lot of information from David Banks's personal experience playing the cyber leader in so many of them. And then it's got the constructed history of the cyber race, and in there all these different sidebars, all these different bits of information, and it was so much more exciting and detailed than anything I'd seen before, and it was just imaginative and gorgeous. It's a great, great book.
Yes.
Number 2, I'm back at the biographies, not an autobiography though this time, with The Life and Scandalous Times of John Nathan Turner by Richard Marsden, later republished as Totally Tasteless, because the name got them in a little bit of trouble.
It did.
This is, again, just a really, really wonderful look at the production of the show at that time. It's incredibly frank, it's incredibly honest, and you get stories from people like Nicola Bryant, who just are incredibly open and honest about how things worked. Fiona Cumming is really, really honest about her relationship with J&T and all the rest of it, and it's actually an emotionally moving book. You know, by the end of it, when J&T passes away, I felt really, really sad. You feel like you're there. You feel like you're there for all of the trials and tribulations of the 1980s. So that's a great book. Number 1, I've been a lot more targeted than you, Rob, but I understand your intent. This is our snap. I've gone with The 60s by Howe, Stammers and Walker.
Yay.
I think that this is everything you said it was. It's another beautifully laid out book. At the time, it had photographs of 60 stories and behind the scenes that we could never have dreamed of seeing before. It is the epitome of fans writing books that fans want to read with that sort of love, that sort of passion, and that detail, but still, as you said, incredibly readable. I think all of that trilogy is great. I understand exactly why you cheated a little there, Rob, and had them all in as one entry, because the 70s and the 80s are fantastic. But I picked the 60s specifically because it started that trilogy and because it just had all these things that we hadn't seen before, back when the 60s was still a bit of a mystery. And in some ways they still are. They're still a harder part of the show to grapple with. So that's my 5.
Oh, very good.
We both said we had some lists of runners-up or honourable mentions. Do you want to go first with yours, Rob?
Well, Dave, I have 10, so
Okay.
what if I do 5 real quick and then switch to you and then come back to me?
Okay, let's do that.
Okay. I also had the Totally Tasteless John Nathan Turner book. I think that's just wonderful. I do have an original hardcover of that, limited edition. It's fabulous. Staying on the J&T theme, I think the J&T memoirs, which are actually by J&T and read by him on audio, are really fantastic. Who on Earth is Tom Baker? Tom's memoir. It's just a mad read. The Patrick Troughton biography by his son Michael, I think, is worthwhile. And also Ace, which is by Sophie Aldred and Mike Tucker. It's a coffee table book, sort of like a diary, memories of Sophie's time on the show. Loads of photos, loads of anecdotes.
All very strong reads. Who on Earth is Tom Baker was definitely a very weird book. I remember grappling with that as I don't know, must have been about 12 or 13, and some of it was a bit much, I've got to say, at that age. It's a really, really weird book. I had a special mention for the John Mark Lafissiere trilogy, particularly the Program Guide, but also the Terrestrial Index and the Universal Data Bank. I bought a copy of that, and it was the new edition that had the credits for season 26, but not the actual story summaries for season 26. That's how up to date it was at the time. But that was the first proper compilation that I owned of just plot summaries and season lists and cast lists and all the rest of it. And then the Terrestrial Index had everything the other way, so you could look up an actor and see what stories they appeared in, stuff like that. And then the Universal Databank was a bit of a sort of an encyclopedia. It was nice but very thick, but they were very much of their time. I almost was going to put in the History of the Universe, because I think that's a fantastic book and I like what it does, but then I realised it probably doesn't quite count as a non-fiction book because it is actually a fictional history. So I thought it would be cheating to put it in there. The Who Adventures by David J. Howe. That is an excellent book about the Virgin New Adventures that probably didn't make my list just because it hasn't quite settled in my mind, being a much more recent one. Child Out of Time by friend of the podcast, Hayden Gribble, absolutely deserves to be in there. That's a really good book. That love of a generation growing up in that period is really interesting because I grew up then too. And finally, the Dalek book and the Canine and Company book. Both of them very, very simple books now. I went to have a look at them recently when I was looking at a topic for another podcast, and I realised just how superficial and not much there was in there, but I was very, very fond of them at the age of about 8, so they were worthy of a mention.
Nice. My final 5 were the handbooks, which are similar to the 60s, 70s and 80s books, but in sort of a paperback format. You know the ones I mean, Dave?
I do know the ones you mean, yes.
From Virgin, yep.
Yep, House Stammers and Walker again, I think.
That's the ones. I did have the Doctor Who Program Guide by Lafissiere, which is what I also think of when I think of those handbooks. I did have the Discontinuity Guide, which is what I think of when I think of Lafissiere's books. Richard Molesworth's Wiped, Doctor Who's Missing Episodes, I think is worth a shout. And also the About Time series, which is just an outrageously well-written guide to the series by Lawrence Miles and Tat Wood. Very opinionated, but when Mad Larry's writing half of it, you're going to be in for a good time. It's full of really wild essays in addition to critiques of every story. I think the About Time books are fabulous, so they get a nod too.
That's really good. And I think, yes, as we expected, sort of between our longer list, there was a lot of overlap. One thing that I think comes across very much in both our lists are those books that, as I said, are written by fans for fans, and that really, really appeal to what it was we wanted to know, and that take the works in a particularly sort of, I want to say, a serious manner. And I don't mean serious as in, this is very serious, boys and girls, but just as in, we love this, we want to treat it well. And that comes across really well in a number of these, but also a lot of them are ones that came through in our childhoods or in our youth, and that's really important. I did consider sort of having on the list a couple more of the Haining books.
Yep.
But I did sort of look at them and felt, they were very special to me in the 80s, but they've been blown out of the water. And to say that, The Time Traveller's Guide or 25 Glorious Years, as much as I loved them as a kid, to say that they are worthy of being on a list instead of, the 60s is just not realistic and not fair. Books got better as time went on.
Yeah, well, it's in at number one for me just because of the nostalgia, but I think of all of them, A Celebration is still very readable. I think people would love to read John Pertwee's love letter to the show, or Verity Lambert's piece, or whatever. I'll just jump in. You mentioned, books being very serious, and on that tack, I think it's also fair to say, Dave, there's some very wanky and niche out there, which no doubt appeals to some, but I've never really gone in for it in the non-fiction Doctor Who world. They're far too much like hard work to wade through. It's like you're studying for a degree. Do you know the ones I mean?
I know exactly the ones you mean, and that's why I say the ones that treat the material seriously but are actually friendly to read.
Yeah, because I accept that some people like that sort of thing, whether it's just the style of writing or whether they think their love of a children's program is maybe more justifiable as an adult if it can be couched in academic terms, whatever. Everyone's different. But those kind of books aren't for me. I've been to uni. I've read my share of wanky shit. Come on, my majors at uni were mass comm and literature. You wouldn't believe the wanky shit I've read, Dave. And when it comes to Doctor Who, I just don't want to go near that sort of writing. No.
No, absolutely. One thing that did occur to me, Rob, is as I was looking through all of these books, I realised that at the age of about 10, I thought the servo robot was the most amazing and important thing from a Mystic Story ever, because obviously there was a photograph of it that existed, and every reference book for about 10 years had a hero shot of the servo robot. Completely unwarranted. It's this tinny thing that's in about 10 minutes of a story. But because there was a photo, it's just in everything. And I thought, wow, this must be a big deal.
Yeah, well, pre-internet, these kinds of books could set the agenda. If these kind of books said something, it was then fact, even if it wasn't.
That's so true as well. And also, just forming opinions and everything. I mean, I suspect that Tomb of the Cybermen's reputation was bolstered by the Cybermen book, just because there's some gorgeous artwork in there of them and some great photos. But look, this was a great topic. There's so many we could have out there. We are so lucky as Doctor Who fans to just have so many of these things. I mean, how many of the cast and crew have done autobiographies?
Loads. Just loads. Yeah.
It's just fantastic. We're very, very fortunate. But we are running up to 20 minutes.
We are. And look, there's so many more we could name. Like, there was a great bio of Verity Lambert a while back. That was fantastic. Manual. The technical manual. I mean, we could go on and on. Folks, if you're out there, just write down all these names we've mentioned, if you've not heard of some of them, and just look them up, see if they're for you, and maybe just go and buy them on eBay. You can get most of them pretty cheap.
You can actually, yes. That's a really good thing.
Yeah.
But it's time to look forward to next month.
Yes.
And I've pulled out of Turlo's hat of Rassilon top 5 space stories.
Oh, wow. That's pretty broad.
That's very broad. That's always fun. It means we'll probably end up attacking it in very different ways. But that's for next month. We've done our books. I think between us, we've probably covered about 30 titles.
Yes.
So we've definitely both cheated on this one. Oh, absolutely. And we should mention, as we did on our last episode, that you have done an episode of Doctor Who Too Hot for TV on this topic as well, where you speak in a lot more depth with Dylan Rees. So, listeners, if you want to know more of Rob's thoughts on this, please do check that out as well.
Yes, please do.
But until then, I've been Dave.
I've been Rob.
And we'll make some more lists next month.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.